Welcome to today's deep dive, everybody. We're going to be taking a look at, a pretty heavy topic, but an important one, I think.
Yeah.
Fascism and anti-fascism.
Oh, yeah.
We got a really interesting set of sources for this one.
Oh, yeah. This is going to be good.
We've got an interview with a theologian and activist who was on the ground in Charlottesville.
Wow.
We've got an article that we're going to be diving into that talks about strategic nonviolent resistance.
Mm-hmm.
And we even have an excerpt from a book called Emergent Strategies.
Oh, very cool.
So we've got a lot to cover.
That sounds like it. It's interesting, too, because we're not just talking about like a dictionary definition of fascism here.
Right.
We're going to be hearing about it from people who have really faced it head on, and then we're going to explore what are some of the strategies for pushing back against it.
Exactly. So to get started, you were saying that to really understand how fascism is showing up in America today, we kind of have to go back to 2017 and the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia.
Exactly. This wasn't just some small gathering, This brought together all sorts of white supremacist and neo-Nazi groups.
Wow.
And it tragically led to the murder of Heather Heyer, who was counter-protesting.
Right.
And I think for a lot of people, that was a huge wake-up call.
Yeah.
This wasn't just online hate anymore. This was having real-world consequences.
Yeah. And that's where our first source comes in an interview with Eric Martin. And he's a theologian and activist who was part of this group called Congregate Charlottesville.
Okay.
And they were trained in nonviolent resistance. And they went right up against these armed hate groups.
Wow.
I can't even imagine the courage that takes.
Yeah, it's incredibly powerful.
Yeah.
And Martin talks about how the history of Charlottesville itself actually played a role in why these groups chose to rally there.
Really?
The city was once majority enslaved, and the debate over removing Confederate statues really became a flashpoint. It was almost like a call for white supremacists to come off the internet, as Martin puts it, and coalesce.
So it wasn't just a random city that they picked. Right.
The history of the place itself had meaning.
Absolutely.
But then you've got all these different groups showing up. How do we even define fascism?
Right.
It feels like it's used so broadly sometimes that it loses all meaning.
That's a struggle even for the experts who study this stuff.
Yeah.
But we do have two really interesting perspectives in our sources.
Okay.
One is from Robert Paxton, who's a historian. He's considered like a leading expert on fascism. And he says it's not so much about a strict ideology as it is about what he calls mobilizing passions.
Mobilizing passions. Okay, you're going to have to break that down for me.
So think about it this way. You know how some politicians will use really strong emotional appeals, like fear or resentment? Well, Paxton says that's what these mobilizing passions are. It's about getting people really fired up, but not necessarily for logical reasons. It's about tapping into those deepest anxieties.
So it's more about manipulation than it is about a well-thought-out plan or ideology.
Yeah, and that kind of ties into another really interesting perspective that we have. Huh?
And that comes from Aimé Césaire.
Okay.
He saw fascism as colonization turned inward.
Wow.
So basically the same mindset that's used to justify colonizing and exploiting other people gets turned against groups within your own society.
That's pretty intense.
Yeah.
So if those are some ways to understand what fascism is, how is that playing out in America today? Are we really seeing fascism here?
That is the question that a lot of people are asking right now.
Right.
And Martin argues that we're seeing it on a few different levels.
Okay.
You've got what he calls the spectacle of figures like Donald Trump.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, even Robert Paxton, that historian we were just talking about, he now considers Trump a fascist.
Oh, wow. That's a pretty big claim.
It is.
Yeah.
And Martin also points to some more obvious examples of white supremacy.
Okay.
People like Steve Bannon with his rhetoric, groups like the Patriot Front doing marches, and even organizations like the Base that are literally trying to put a fascist leader in charge.
That's scary to think about groups actively trying to overturn our government.
Right. And it's not just these really obvious things. Martin also talks about what he calls everyday fascism.
What does that mean?
So it's like when you see things like ICE detention centers or the militarized response to protests like Standing Rock, and people just kind of accept that as normal.
Yeah.
It's that kind of erosion of our democratic values.
Right. He even talks about how Confederate culture itself is kind of like a homegrown American fascism.
Yes.
It makes you think about how these ideas have been around for a long time, and maybe they're just resurfacing in new ways.
And that's exactly what Paxton's idea of fascist creep is all about.
Okay.
He says it's a slow process. It happens in stages.
Right.
And it can eventually lead to full-blown fascism.
Wow.
And he actually warns that the U.S. might be moving from a slow creep to more of a march towards fascism.
That is a seriously disturbing thought. And it makes me wonder, how do we even begin to fight back against something that insidious?
That's a great question, and that's where we'll pick up next time when we start to talk about anti-fascism and the strategies for resisting fascism.
Okay, so join us next time as we continue this deep dive
Absolutely.
into this heavy but very important topic.
Can't wait.
So if fascism is this like creeping, insidious thing, how do we even fight back?
Right.
It feels like a lot of people think anti-fascism is just about like street fights and brawls with these hate groups.
Yeah, that's definitely a common image, but it's not the whole picture.
Right.
Anti-fascism actually takes a ton of different forms.
Okay.
You know, it could be direct action, it could be protests, education, even just community organizing.
Right.
It's about actively opposing fascism in all its forms, not just the most dramatic ones.
Okay.
And like Martin points out, it's not just about what you're against, it's also about what you're for. It's about building communities that are so full of love and solidarity that hate just can't take root.
I love that definition that came out of Charlottesville, a politics of love. It sounds so simple, but also really powerful. Like building a world where fascism just can't survive.
Right. It's a beautiful goal.
Yeah.
But it does raise some tricky questions.
Like what?
Like, how do you practice nonviolence?
Right.
And even more so, how do you love your enemy when they're actively trying to hurt you in your community?
Yeah, Martin really wrestles with that question, especially coming from his background as a Catholic.
Yeah.
He talks about his own struggles with it, and even brings up his dissertation research on Dan Berrigan, who was this Catholic priest and peace activist.
Oh, wow.
And, Berrigan was super committed to nonviolence.
Yeah.
But then you have groups like the Nicaraguan Sandinistas who are fighting this brutal dictatorship.
Right.
And they believe that they had to use armed resistance. So how do you reconcile those two things?
Yeah, it's a really tough one. And Martin admits that sometimes insisting on nonviolence in every situation, it can actually be counterproductive.
Okay.
It can even put vulnerable people at more risk.
Wow.
So he thinks you have to be really careful about applying nonviolence as this kind of one-size-fits-all solution.
All right.
Especially when you're talking about people who are already the most likely to be targets of violence.
So it's more about finding strategies that actually keep people safe, not just sticking to some dogma.
Exactly.
Okay.
And Martin challenges us to think really hard about what loving your enemy really means in this context.
Right.
Like, how can you possibly love someone who is spewing hate and trying to harm you?
Yeah, that's what I struggle with. It feels impossible sometimes.
Well, Martin's take is that loving a fascist means wanting them to stop being a fascist. It's about wanting them to break free from that ideology.
Right.
And he says that sometimes that means confronting them, disrupting them.
Oh, yeah.
Stopping them from spreading their hate.
So it's not about being passive. It's about actively intervening to stop the spread of that poison. I guess that makes sense.
And this brings us to our next source.
Okay.
Which is George Lakey's article on how to resist fascism without falling into the traps that can actually make it stronger.
Interesting.
Lakey says we need to be smarter than just reacting to whatever fascist groups do.
Right.
We need to target the root cause of their rise in the first place.
What does he think that root cause is?
He argues that it all comes down to economic inequality.
Okay.
And the policies that the elites use to keep widening the gap between the rich and the poor. And that creates this perfect condition for polarization and resentment, which fascist groups then exploit.
So it's not enough to just yell at the fascists. We have to address the underlying systems that make their message appealing in the first place.
Exactly. And Lakey uses this really fascinating historical example to make his point.
What's that?
He talks about the Scandinavian left in the 1920s.
Okay.
They were dealing with a very similar rise in fascism, even Nazi threats.
Wow.
But instead of getting into these violent clashes, they focused on dismantling economic inequality through nonviolent revolution. And guess what? They actually succeeded.
Really?
They created a more just society.
Wow.
And basically pushed the fascists out.
That's incredible. They beat back the Nazis without even resorting to violence. How did they pull that off?
Well, Lakey contrasts their approach with what happened in Germany and Italy, where the left got caught up in fighting the fascists on their own terms.
Right.
All that violence just created more chaos, which ended up helping Hitler and Mussolini take power.
So that's a lesson we need to learn from. Don't get sucked into their game.
Right. Lakey even brings up a more recent example, a Proud Boys rally in Philadelphia.
Okay.
A bunch of well-meaning progressive activists went to counter-protests, But they ended up playing right into the Proud Boys' hands.
How so?
By reacting to their provocations, they actually gave them more attention and legitimacy.
It's like that old saying, don't feed the trolls.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Leahy is arguing for a much more strategic approach, one that starves the fascists of attention, and instead focuses on building a positive, inclusive vision for the future that appeals to a wider range of people.
So it's not just about fighting fire with fire, it's about being smarter and more strategic. I get it. But then there's that last source, the one on emergent strategies. I have to admit, I'm still a little fuzzy on what that even means.
Okay, so emergent strategies might sound intimidating, but it's actually a pretty practical framework for creating lasting change.
Okay.
It's all about small-scale actions,
Right.
decentralized networks, being able to adapt and learning as you go.
Right.
It's about building power from the ground up, not just relying on these top-down solutions like laws and policies.
So it's about creating the right conditions for change to happen organically rather than trying to force it.
That's the idea. And here's the really interesting part. The religious right has been using emergent strategies for decades.
Really?
And they've been incredibly effective at shaping our social systems.
Wow.
They focus on building relationships, influencing communities on a local level, and slowly shifting the culture to align with their agenda.
So it's not just about protests and legislation. It's about playing the long game.
Exactly.
But that also sounds kind of scary. Like, what if those fascist groups start using those same tactics?
That's exactly what's happening.
Oh, no.
Which is why it's so important to understand how these strategies work. Neo-Nazi and patriot movements are using decentralized networks, online organizing.
Wow.
And they're even twisting the idea of dual power to try and build their own parallel systems of authority.
Hold on, what's dual power?
It's basically the idea of building alternative structures and institutions alongside the existing ones.
Right.
So that you're ready to take over when the system collapses.
Okay.
It's been used by a lot of social movements, but these fascist groups are trying to co-opt it for their own ends.
That is scary. So we need to be just as strategic and organized as they are if we want to counter them.
Absolutely. Richie, the author of that book on emergent strategies, she really emphasizes the need for proactive community building, creating these diverse networks of resistance.
Okay.
And being super vigilant about fascist infiltration.
Wow.
It's about creating this web of interconnected communities that can support each other, share resources, and resist attempts to divide and conquer.
So it's about building something stronger and more resilient, not just playing defense all the time.
Exactly. And this brings us back to Eric Martin's call to action.
Okay.
Specifically within Catholic spaces, but also beyond. He urges us to start acting locally.
Right.
To find like-minded people who are committed to love, justice, and mercy.
He even suggests looking to past resistance movements,
Yes.
like what happened in Charlottesville and Ferguson, to learn from their experiences.
Right. There's so much we can learn from those who have been on the front lines of these struggles.
And Martin reminds us that we don't have to reinvent the wheel.
Right.
He points to Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, who was this big figure in the civil rights movement. Heschel famously said, "I'm praying with my feet."
I love that quote.
Meaning that he saw his activism as a form of prayer.
Yeah.
And Martin encourages people of all faiths to find those creative ways to combine their beliefs with action.
Beautiful.
I love that idea that fighting fascism can be a spiritual practice, but it also feels overwhelming sometimes. Like, what can one person really do against all this?
Martin says it doesn't have to be some grand gesture or heroic act.
Right.
It's about using your existing skills and passions, whatever they may be.
Okay.
Baking, writing, teaching, even just creating beauty within your community. Every act of love and resistance counts.
Yeah, all those little acts can actually add up to something bigger.
That's the beauty of it.
Yeah.
And as we kind of wrap up this deep dive, I'm curious, what's really sticking with you from all of this? What feels particularly relevant or insightful?
I think, honestly, it's those emergent strategies. It's kind of mind-blowing to realize that these small-scale, decentralized tactics, they've been so effective both for groups like the religious right and now, kind of scarily, for these fascist groups.
Right.
It makes me realize that we can't just keep reacting. Yeah. We need to be thinking long term. We need to be building those networks of resistance now.
That's such a huge takeaway. It's not enough to just say we hate fascism.
Right.
We have to build the kind of world where it can't thrive.
Right.
And that takes long-term vision, it takes sustained effort, and it takes this deep commitment to, love, justice, equality, all the good stuff.
It's like planting seeds, right? seeds of hope and nurturing them into something that's strong enough to weather any storm.
Perfect analogy.
Mm.
And that's where I think Martin's call to action within those Catholic spaces and beyond is so important.
Mm-hmm.
It reminds us that resistance can start anywhere, even in unexpected places.
Yeah.
It's about finding those communities, using our skills, and living out our values in the world.
So it's not just about those big protests or those political campaigns.
Right.
It's also about those everyday acts of courage. You know, the connections that we build, the conversations that we have, the beauty that we create, the love that we share, it all matters.
Absolutely. At the end of the day, it's that spirit of love and resistance that's the strongest antidote to the poison of fascism.
Well, I'm definitely walking away from this deep dive feeling both a sense of urgency, A&D, a sense of hope.
Yeah.
You know, the threat is real, but so is our ability to fight back and build something better.
That brings us to a final thought for you to chew on. How can you contribute to that politics of love in your own community? What small acts of resistance, creation, or connection can you make to help build a world where fascism simply has no room to grow?
That's a question worth sitting with. And we've only just scratched the surface here today, but hopefully this deep dive has given you some insights, some tools, and some inspiration to keep exploring these ideas. Thanks for joining us, and until next time, keep diving deep.